who's heard of HTTP only and secure flags? Don't be shy. By now it's good. Okay, I gotta tell you, funny enough, is not that long ago you would go to rooms and you would get 2 hands out of 50 or something like that. So it's gotten better. Most people, I'm assuming the shyness factor, I'm assuming that 90% knew about it and 50% raised their hands. Obviously they're crucial. Obviously you want to use them. If your framework doesn't already do so for you by default, then you better want to brush up on the knowledge about these and make sure that you enable those. Okay. What else is here? So here we're talking a little bit more about the in URL session ID. Why is that a problem? Most of you might know this already. The challenge is if anything that you do through URLs is ultimately in the open and is ultimately being logged on various servers, okay? And one thing that's funny is people sometimes have this weird concept of security where they assume the only bad guys in the world are guys working out of the garage, and therefore they first have to hack into the server, then they have to hack into the cache, and they have to do all these, so it's not that big a deal. What people don't realize is that there's a lot of disgruntled IT personnel at your ISP who don't have to hack into anything, but yet they see all these URLs all the time. Okay, and so the last thing you want in those URL logs is session IDs, especially in the early days. It's gotten better, where those often wouldn't expire for weeks in a row, right? So and then of course you have the wonder of Google, right? Anyone ever tried an in URL JSession ID with Google, and you'll find millions and millions of session IDs. Many of them might be months old and you can ignore them. Some of them might be a day old. Worth a try. So you get the picture. Ideally, you don't use that. There should be no use of them unless of course you have some cookie restrictions where you don't want to force the user to have cookies enabled. Then you can still do it through posts, by the way. Posts are way more elegant than in the URL because at least the post content doesn't get logged and isn't that easily discoverable. But URL content is just free knowledge, okay? So far so good. Anyone with me? Of course, the other thing is I can even get this very much easier. Most people have heard of the referrer header, right? The one that's misspelled, by the way. That's the one funny thing. It's literally misspelled in the spec itself, okay? That's what you get when an international team starts building specs. So consequently, it is actually misspelled in the browser implementations too, okay? The problem here is, and the concept in a nutshell is very simple. When you make a request to page site A, and from A you're being referred to site B, then there's a referrer header in there that says where you're coming from, okay? And of course, if you're nifty as an attacker, in the case of our context here, this session that is, what you want to do is if it's in the URL, if you have an URL-based session token, all I need to do is get you to my site through all the many means we've heard before, and now I can just farm the referrer header and I've got your cookie, your token. Make sense? So no good yet again. All right, and then the other thing is, by the way, is session termination. So I could give a long talk on that. I'm going to make that one short. But the funny thing with session termination is, guess what is one of the most common ways of how people implement session termination, meaning the logout button? They kill the cookie. Right? It's so simple. God, you gotta love JavaScript, right? No round trip. Oh, how beautiful. I mean, that's what developers will tell you. What an elegant solution. I don't even have a round trip. All I do is when you click up there, there's JavaScript code on the client, take the cookie out. You're now logged out. Anyone see a problem with that? The server state's still there, right? And in the worst case, on the server side, you had some other developer saying, okay, well, obviously I can't have it sit around forever, but I think a day is fine. Let's just sit there for a day, and within a day, I'll kill the session. It's just bad practice, very bad practice for all the obvious reasons. You have no idea how often we find that, okay? All right, time for a joke. All right, I'm assuming I'm hearing some smiling, and so you'll pass that. So the takeaway here, the bottom line of this first part of the session is that you don't have, in summary, you don't have native session support built into the internet, if you will, HTTP that is. So everyone builds their own, or you get one through your provider of choice, your framework of choice. And the important keyword here is not all of them are created equal. There are some very strong ones that you'll be pretty good with, and there are some that are really weak and they're just falling victim to attacks very quickly. So just be aware of that. Don't take it for granted. It's one of those things where the developer mentality kicks in, and I think you all know what I'm referring to, which is the moment that it works, the moment that I have state floating around and it works, and I could actually, I could associate requests and there's a logout and it all seems to be QA'd, victory is declared. I've seen do that. No one really bothers thinking about, well, yeah, it seems to work, but is it secure? Is it really going to stand various different attack vectors, which we're going to talk about in a little bit here. All right, so let's talk a little bit of assessment techniques. So, whether you are a good guy or a bad guy, of course you're all good guys, I can assume that much. Here's how you're going to go try and be a white hat and test in a positive way, okay? What are some of the things you want to do? For one, you probably want to use various tools. You've heard this many times before, right? There's all kinds of tools out there. I'm not going to bother you with all of them. I will have to say there is a thing called Sensic Hailstorm. Voila, I just deserve my next paycheck. But ultimately, it's your choice, right? There's high-end professional solutions like Sensic Hailstorm, second paycheck. Or there is, various open source. Of course, open source tends to be, and I don't mean this in a very bad way, but you get what you pay for, right? So you have to kind of figure that out too, how much value you get out of these different solutions. So that's one thing, and you want to do the usual that is applicable to any sort of 5-step hacking attack 101, which is first you do what? You map out the application. You've heard this many times before, right? So you play with the application, you examine all the traffic that's going over the wire, you understand what all is on the server side, what all is, that's usual. It isn't any different with session attacks, okay? The only thing that is different or not different per se, is that you're going to very quickly try to home in on how do they actually implement that session state we talked about. What goes over the wire to identify this request with a session that's either stored on the server side or a session view state kept on the client. You want to figure that out very quickly. And you know by now that you have various means where that could be. It could be in URL, it could be in post parameters, it could be in the shape of a cookie. The next thing you do when you see something going, so the first thing obviously you want to ask yourself, hopefully it's always going to be the same thing, right? So if you have hundreds of requests and they all have the same thing going over the wire, there's a fair chance that has to do with some of the session state. So the next thing is you want to try to see if you can make some sense out of that, okay? So sense, what I mean by that is you want to see whether you can actually decode it, if it's encoded, whether there's some sequence in it, and whether you can therefore guess it, whether there's some timestamp mechanism, and so you can replace it with other timestamps, etc., right? Start poking around. It's the old attack trial and error process, right? You want to very clearly understand related capabilities, login and logout mechanisms, right? As I said before, figure out how they implemented a logout. Is it really logged out? Is the session really gone or not? Stuff like that. And that you can actually do without even having to attack the session, right? Meaning the session, the token itself. Just log in very regularly, right? Hit the logout button, and then you go back and send it again. And if you're still in business, you know that they did the good old, just kill the cookie mechanism. And that's obviously a good attack vector, and so on and so forth. So I think so far so good. I've just watched time here. The other thing that people will do in this context is try to get more than one account with different privileges, right? And this is where I'm going into a gray zone with respect to the session here, because I know I call it the session management, and in realities we're kind of fluctuating around session management, authentication, various other things, but they are all related, so bear with me if you will. So go get different account types, try to see whether you can do anything around privilege escalation, etc., etc. So far so good, everybody? Session fixation, anyone heard of that before? Don't be shy, a few of you have. Very simple mechanism. It goes right along with what I said earlier, right? What if a server implementation of session goes along the following? I get a token, could be any token on the planet, and I will say, oh, you know what, that token is not in my token cache. Because ultimately as a server, I'm kind of dumbing stuff down, so bear with me, right? The hardcore developers are going to probably come to me later and say, well, it's a little more complicated. It is, but I don't want to lose half the room. So to keep it simple, highest level implementation mechanism is you're going to have a session cache on the server, and that is going to say, here's a token, and here's who that belongs to, and who he is, and what he's allowed to do, and whatever else, okay? Again, I'm simplifying. Well, I get a new token. The first thing I'm going to say is, if I implement this in a really bad way, is, oh, I don't have that token nowhere. So I'm going to do what? Redirect you to the login. Right? Now you're going to send that back, same token, and it's going to have credentials. I'm going to go against my credentials database and say, oh yeah, that's Lars, I know him, that's his credentials. I'm going to take that token he gave me, I'm going to stick it into my cache, and I'm going to associate it with Lars. See anything wrong with that implementation? as a bad guy, all I have to do is send you a URL with my token that I gave you. You follow that link, the server says, I don't know that token, can you please authenticate? Oh great, now I know the token, I'm associating Lars with that. What's the bad news? I gave you the token to begin with, so now I know the token. Didn't even have to hack it, didn't even have to guess it. I know the token because it's my token to begin with. That's called session fixation. It's been around for a long time, it's gotten better, but ideally you don't want to just take any random token, okay? It better be a token that you generate, and you generate that as a result of the login page. So far so good? Okay. There are various related attacks that I'm going to talk about in a minute, like CSRF, that I wanted to spend more time on because I find that to be the most relatively related to session management attacks. What else here? Well, and then we could talk a long time about cookie scopes. Anyone aware of that? So cookies have scopes, right? And one thing that's often not really appreciated enough is that you might very well have that scope be one where you have subdomains and you can still mess with that cookie and applying it to subdomains depending on how lax or non-lax the scope is. We probably don't want to go there right now in much detail. And then, as we said, log disclosures and so on and so forth. All right, so cool. Related attack vectors. Session management is at the heart of anything you do if you build a web app. Everyone agree? Unless, of course, you don't really build an app, you're just linking documents. But if you do anything with state, and that's the definition of an app in my mind, then you will have that. Well, around that are various other attack vectors that are related. And this is where, again, I'm stretching the definition of the session a little bit. Session fixation we just talked about in hijacking is obviously when you figure out the session token. One thing, just to be clear, right? Some people will tell you cross-site scripting is related. I can see that argument. My problem with that argument, though, is that cross-site scripting, if I cross-site script you, I own you. Session is just one problem that you have at that point, okay? But obviously, if I cross-site script you, I will get to your session very easily, right? Because now I've got access to your token, to your cookies and everything else. So keep that in mind. Weak passwords. This is a real problem. Anyone heard about the Sarah Palin attack during the election time? What happened? What happened was very simple, right? Someone didn't even have to be all that bright, figured out that she had a Yahoo account and figured out that the easiest way to get to her data is to reset her password. Up comes the password challenge, and it happens to be one of those, what's your favorite pet name? Well, if you're a celebrity, your pet name is not that hard to figure out. And voila, you're in. So keep that in mind, okay? We talk a lot about in these sessions, and I'm making the same mistake, if you will, right now. We like to talk, as techies, we like to talk a lot about, have you figured out the encryption mechanism? Have you figured out how you predict it? Have you figured out whether the random generator is random enough? That's all great, guys, but ultimately, often the attacks are so much simpler. Have you figured out how to reset the guy's password? Bingo, I didn't have to guess anything, didn't have to break anything. So keep that in mind because those are related attack vectors that make life so much easier. SQL injection, right? One of the first usages of SQL injection was to make it past the login page, right? Very related. Now, luckily, most frameworks have figured that one out. What is kind of funny though is that very many apps that we test have figured it out on the login field. 5 pages later, they haven't figured it out. Talk about consistency in your coding practices, right? Bypass vulnerabilities, we talked about that. One thing that's always fun to play with, guys, and you will be surprised how often you're being forced through HTTPS. And if you just take the S out of your URL, guess what happens? The application responds just fine. Because when it went from development to production, guess what? The configuration was just brought right over, and in the development phase, no one bothered to really insist on HTTPS. So both is mapped, and you're bypassing that before you even know. Okay, all that kind of stuff. And then CSRF, we're gonna talk in more detail. Who all knows about CSRF? I was doing the knows because otherwise you have to out yourself not knowing, and I want to have to do that to you guys. Who all knows CSRF? All right, so fair enough. So I'm not going to go and spend a whole lot of time on it, but there were various people who didn't. So cross-site request forgery, which, oh, by the way, just as a joke here, this is my own joke, not a cartoon joke. If you want to ever prove that you're an expert in this space, by the way, you know how you prove being an expert over beers? Cross-site scripting has what? XSS. Cross-site request forgery has CSRF. See, that's what we do. Experts like to mix it up so we can see who's an insider or not. Because if someone says cross-site request forgery with an X, you're not part of the elite. Okay? So that's my small joke there. So cross-site request for trace. So how does it work? It's very, very simple at the high level anyways. It has